Thank you so much. After tonight's program concludes at about 6:45, the senator has to make a flight, so we're going to have to sneak out pretty quickly, but there should be plenty of time for your questions after Director Bill Lacey has a few questions for the senator. When we sat down to plan this year's presidential lecture series on the topic of Bob Dole's 5-decade-long legacy of leadership, it seemed natural to feature someone who served with Senator Dole, worked closely with him on matters large and small, and shared his Midwestern, small-c conservative and pragmatic values. We kept coming back to tonight's guest as the colleague among dozens, perhaps scores, that best exemplified these traits. John Claggett Danforth has had a truly exemplary career as a distinguished United States Senator, as a special presidential envoy to Sudan to help settle a 19-year-old civil war between North and South, and as ambassador to the United Nations. At the same time, Senator Danforth is an ordained Episcopalian minister and a noted author whose book, Faith and Politics, How the Moral Values Debate Divides America and How to Move Forward Together, framed a central question, or more than one central question, to today's politics. Is religion essentially divisive or potentially unifying? And how can we get past wedge cultural issues and solve our country's very real problems? Senator Danforth was born in St. Louis, Missouri, received his bachelor's degree from Princeton in 1958, and attended both law and divinity graduate schools at Yale. He was elected in 1968 in his first run for public office to be Missouri Attorney General, and while he was there, he had a penchant for picking distinguished and interesting staffers. Among his assistant attorneys general were Kit Bond, John Ashcroft, and Clarence Thomas. Not bad. When Danforth entered politics, Missouri was a relatively Democratic state, with both its U.S. senators and governor regularly being a Democrat. Danforth once explained that he became a Republican for, and I'll quote, "the same reason you sometimes choose which movie to see. It's the one with the shortest line." In any case, it seemed to work. In 1976, Danforth won the election to succeed retiring Senator Stuart Symington and was reelected in 1982. This illustrious seat, I should add, was previously held by both Thomas Hart Benton and Harry Truman. 6 years later, he pretty much shellacked current Missouri Governor Jay Nixon in his third re-election campaign. I looked this up, 68% to 32%? Ouch. Danforth chose not to run for a fourth term and retired from the Senate in 1995. The next year, he still found time to make the formal nominating speech for Senator Bob Dole's presidential run in the convention. We'll probably never know just how close Senator Danforth came to being vice president, unless one of you asks. 1 week before the 2000 Republican National Convention, some pretty reputable sources said that Dick Cheney, the man charged with leading the selection process, recommended the senator to then Governor George W. Bush. There was, I hear, an obligatory secret meeting with the nominee. Senator Danforth conveniently stepped down from an appointed position in the Waco investigations, saying that an unforeseen political opportunity may have come up. And then, somehow Cheney ended up on the ticket instead. I'm not a counterfactual historian, but that's one I keep replaying in my head over and over and over. I'll leave it at that. In September 2001, President Bush appointed Senator Danforth a special envoy to Sudan. He brokered a peace deal that officially ended a terrible civil war between the northern Islamic government and the Christian-backed Sudanese rebels in the south. Of course, elements of that conflict still remain unresolved, as has the separate Darfur conflict, which smolders tragically to this day. On July 1st, 2004, Senator Danforth was sworn in as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He continued to work to bring peace to Sudan, but only stayed at the UN for 6 months. Danforth was mentioned as a possible successor for Secretary of State Colin Powell, but he resigned his post in a letter that said, 47 years ago, I married the girl of my dreams, and at this point in my life, what is most important to me is to spend more time with her. Wow. Danforth memorably officiated the funeral services of former President Ronald Reagan on June 11, 2004 at the Washington National Cathedral. He did the same for Washington Post executive Katharine Graham 3 years earlier. More recently, Senator Danforth has written a series of articles and the aforementioned book on the subject of faith and politics that have elicited much debate. One thing that is not debatable is the thoughtful, sincere, and uniting way that Senator Danforth has practiced both his politics and his faith. It's an honor to welcome him here to this stage. Senator Danforth.
Thank you. Senator, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time tonight. Can you tell us how you got started in politics and how you got attracted to public service?
When I was in fifth grade, 10 years old. My parents took my brother Don and me to Washington, and I was from a totally non-political family. I can remember sitting in the Senate gallery, looking down at the floor of the Senate, saying to myself, I want to do that sometime. And I can also remember exactly, word for word, what my dad said as we were filing out of the Senate gallery. He said, "What a bunch of windbags." That was the beginning. And you know how rare it is to want to do something when you're 10 years old and end up doing exactly what you wanted. But I have to say that it was worth it. I enjoyed the Senate a lot, and I really recommend politics. I still do to people who are interested.
Do you, can you tell us a little bit, kind of fill in some of the information about your career? We know the 3 terms in the Senate, but just kind of outline the different things that you did in politics through your career.
Well, as I say, from the time I was 10 years old, I wanted to be in politics, and that was my intention until right before my senior year in college. And I had the thought at that point that I should go into the ministry instead. So I abandoned the notion of politics and went to Yale Divinity School. Took me a while to decide that really was not right for me, so I shifted to the law school, but ended up with both degrees at the same time, ended up getting ordained, and I still haven't been defrocked, although some people probably think I should have been. But I was admitted to the bar and practiced law, and then when I was 32 years old, I was elected State Attorney General in Missouri, and I served in that capacity for 2 terms, 8 years. After my first 2 years, I ran unsuccessfully against Stuart Symington, who was then the incumbent senator. And then 2 years after that, I was reelected to the Senate, and then I was in 1976 elected when Senator Symington retired. So I then served in the Senate for 3 terms.
Your career is really lengthy, and we want to talk about it and about Bob Dole and a little bit about contemporary politics. But one of the things that strikes me that I thought, especially our students, but everybody here would be interested in knowing, you played major roles in ending the starvation in Cambodia in the late 70s, and as John was talking about, the war in Sudan. What do you believe that America's role should be in situations like Darfur?
Well, I think America is a force for peace and humanitarian relief insofar as we can do it. And it's generally very hard, maybe even impossible, to do it solo. In Sudan, it was essential that it was not only a very visible presence for the United States, but also that we worked closely with other countries, especially the countries surrounding Sudan and Africa, and also other countries, particularly the British and the Norwegians. So I think trying to find collaborative ways of doing things is important. I also think it's important to try to focus attention on problems, and that was the situation in Africa back in the 1980s. I got concerned, and Cambodia before that, I got concerned about the problem of hunger, and the United States, just by being focused and appealing to the American people, as we've done in Haiti, and also with at least some measure of government support, can be a force for trying to relieve suffering in the world. We can't do it all ourselves. It isn't really the heart of American policy, but I think it's something important that we do.
When did you first meet Bob Dole, and what were your initial impressions of the man?
I'm sure I met Bob Dole well before I went to the Senate, although I can't remember precisely how I did, but I know I can remember that he spoke at a dinner in Kansas City at one point, and I spoke at the same dinner. So I've known him, I suppose, since the 1960s, but I got to know him very well when I got to the Senate, because we served on the same committee, the Finance Committee, which is a very important committee and very, very time consuming. So you get to know other members well. And Bob became the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and then the ranking Republican on the Finance Committee. And then, of course, he became the Republican leader in the Senate in whenever it was, sometime in the mid-1980s. And he asked me to make his nominating speech. I did not do what Jonathan said. I did not nominate him at the convention. But when he was elected the Republican leader in the Senate, the Republicans met in the old Senate chamber, and the procedure is that somebody is asked to make he asked me to make his nominating speech, and then there may be a couple of seconding speeches, and then there are other candidates, and there's an election. So I was honored that Bob asked me to make his speech. And I remember the theme for that speech, which is, I think, an important thing to know about Bob, in that what really sets him apart as a public servant and as a senator is his soul. I mean, this is something that you've got to know about Bob Dole. He is very funny. He's just got the world's best sense of humor, and he's a very capable legislator. But he has a real heart. He's got in him the old Midwestern sort of populist strain, not the angry, Mountie Bank kind of populism that people usually mean by that phrase, but a real empathy with people who are having a hard time. Veterans, clearly, disabled people, clearly. But watching him 18 years close up, particularly in the Finance Committee, but also as leader, he has a heart. He has this great empathy for people who are having a hard time. And to me, especially for a Republican, it's a very important quality.
He's been out of the Senate now for 14 years. He's been, as we've talked with some of our other guests about how active he's been in his post-Senate career. But going back to the days in the Senate, the time that you spent with him, what do you think that as currently the longest running Republican leader in the history of the United States Senate, what do you think his legacy as a senator will be?
Bob Dole's notion of being a senator, and Bob Dole's notion of being a leader was to legislate. And it was, it was during an important, really transitional period for the country, especially during the Reagan years, when, the issue was what should be the role and scope and cost and reach and weight of the federal government. And he had a leadership role either in the Finance Committee or as our leader during that entire time. But nowadays, it seems in politics that a lot of it is sort of setting yourself up to stop something or to offset what the other side is doing. And so it's as though they're playing defense all the time. Well, Bob played offense, not defense. In other words, he was a legislator. He was interested in doing things. He was interested in enacting legislation. He was interested in trying to make things not magically better, because government doesn't do that, but relatively better. And my mental image of Bob Dole, and this, it just happened so darn often. I would be interested in some legislation, or somebody else, I'd hear him say this: But when he was our leader, he'd pass me in the hallway and he'd say, "Got it worked out yet?" I mean, that's Dole. Got it worked out yet? What did he mean? Have you figured it out? Have you all, I mean, whoever the competing forces are in this legislation, have you got a deal? Can we move forward? Can I, as the leader, move forward with this? And there is this conference room in the leader's office. It's a little room with a big table. And it was always filled with senators and staffers sort of loaded against the walls. So it was this claustrophobic feeling in this thing. And you had the feeling Dole didn't want you to leave this tiny little room until you got some kind of a deal worked out. But that was his nature. How do you get on with the business of legislation? It was never, how do you just flummox the other guy?
I'd like to shift gears and move to more contemporary politics. And you published an important book just a few years ago called Faith in Politics. And there's a lot of important points in that one, but this is one quote that I pulled out of it that I really wanted you to talk a little bit about tonight. It says, you wrote, "Republicans have managed to transform themselves from the sunny optimism of Ronald Reagan into a party that is harsh, unattractively, and increasingly unpopular." Kind of explain what you meant.
Oh, did I say that? I'm sorry. How unseemly. I think that, Reagan was so terrific and he was so positive, and he had a vision of America that was great, and people wanted. Mike Deaver wrote. Remember, Deaver was his guy, and Deaver wrote, the thing about Reagan was people liked to please him. That was true. People really liked to please Ronald Reagan, and it was because of that optimism and that sunny disposition. And I don't think a political party gets very far if it's just relentlessly sour. And I think that you can risk becoming that, and I risk becoming that. I get just worked up about Obama and how terrible he is, and you just get sort of swept away by your own negativism. But I think we have to do more than that, and I think that we have to point to the future of the country. Maybe that's the mission of people who are in politics, to think about, okay, what's in it, not for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren, and how can you paint that kind of picture for the country so that people will want to maybe do something other than grab every benefit they can for themselves and build a country for future generations. And I think that if all a political party does is accentuate the negative, and if all a political party does is to try to win elections by making people angry, and one way to make people angry is to really be sanctimonious and claim that, I'm on the side of God and you're on the side of the devil. I think that's not a good approach for a party.
The candidates who have, obviously the Republican Party took severe beatings in 2006 and 2008, but the candidates who've been successful since President Obama's election, they've run campaigns and had campaign messages that were more traditionally conservative, that focused on fiscal and economic issues rather than social issues. Do you think that's a fundamental change that the party may be going through, or is that just an aberration?
Well, I think it can be, and I think it has to be, because I think we've got a great opportunity and really a responsibility to have a couple of good election years ahead, and that there are things that all Republicans, really there are things that all Republicans agree on. all Republicans are fiscally conservative, relatively speaking. Republicans believe in limited government. Republicans believe in the private sector. Republicans believe in trying to keep the hand of government light on the country rather than heavy. Republicans believe in engaged foreign policy and strong national defense and free trade. These are, I think, the fundamentals of the Republican Party. Where Republicans start scrapping among themselves are on these wedge issues, these social issues, whether it's prayer in school or, I mean, the origin of that book was the Terry Schiavo case, stuff like that. And I think that, people work themselves up on that, and you lose your cohesiveness as a political party, lose your message, and appear to be kind of off a little bit when you do that. So I think that if our party regains its basic message where there's really unanimous agreement or virtually unanimous agreement on the major issues, we should have a good immediate future.
What's happened to, what's your assessment of the level of civility and bipartisanship in today's Senate versus when you served with Bob Dole?
I think it was more fun then. I mean, one thing about Dole and a sense of humor is it was hard not to have fun when you were around Bob Dole, but I do think, I think back to, on the Finance Committee with Howard Baker and Bob Dole and Moynihan and people in both parties, and it was really fun to serve with them. And the center was more real in American politics, and the parties were less polarized, and it was less kind of constant warfare and more, as Dole would say, working things out. And I think that that's more enjoyable. The center has been cut out from American politics. Both parties have gravitated toward their poles, and both parties have become meaner as a result of it, and I think less effective as a result of it.
What do you think, if you were in the Senate today, this is kind of a tough question, maybe a little bit unfair, but if you were in the Senate today, what would you try to do to go back to the way it was?
I'd try to get my wife to remain married to me. Yeah. Well, I think it would be a good idea to try to build a social life for members of the Senate, and I think that that's not there anymore. And we had a decent social life, and it was bipartisan. I mean, the closest friends we had were just about equally divided between Republicans and Democrats when I was in the Senate. But now I'm told that people in both parties don't really even speak to each other. One now former senator told me that even when spouses would take trips on buses, the Democrats would sit together and the Republicans would sit together, which is really weird. And so I think that trying to reconstitute a social life, making sure that the Senate schedule is one that makes room for that, so that you can see each other in the evenings, maybe spend some time. It's sad, this was not true when I was in the Senate, but in the old days, they used to go back in the Secretary of the Senate's office and have drinks at about 5 in the afternoon. Maybe popping a few drinks would be good for members of Congress. But I think that would be good. But I think that the problems are deeper than that. The quality of the media now is awful. I don't follow the blogosphere, but I'm told that that's pretty bad. I think that the network TV programs, whether you're watching Glenn Beck or Keith Olbermann, it's just, it's really too much. It's over the top. and that it's gotten too rough. And I also, some people say this, and it makes sense to me, that not so much in the Senate, but in the House of Representatives, one of the problems is that most congressional districts are safe districts. So that for a safe district, all you have to do to keep your seat is to win the primary, which means appealing to the base, which means you don't have to appeal to anybody who's not part of your political base. And that tends to further polarize politics, so that's probably part of the problem.
In Faith in Politics, you also wrote a chapter on character assassination, and the example that you used was a personal friend, Justice Clarence Thomas. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the confirmation of Clarence Thomas was the worst thing that I've ever lived through, and I hope I never live through anything like it again. It was absolutely awful. Here was a person whom I cared about, still do care about a lot, and whether you agree with Clarence Thomas or not, he is as kind and decent a human being as you would ever want to know. He is just one of God's good people. And the suffering that he went through was unbelievable. I mean, repeatedly just reduced to loud, sobbing tears, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to sit still. You know, just constant fidgets. And it was terrible to see. And I think it's not worth it, you know, that kind of character assassination isn't worth it. Supreme Court confirmations now have become just single-minded battles over the issue of Roe versus Wade and abortion. That's all that they are. And they remain that. But nothing has topped Clarence Thomas's confirmation, though, as an effort to destroy a human being, and it was terrible. And I think that the antidote is for people to see it for what it is and really speak out, whether the Republicans or Democrats, whether they agree with the nominee or not. Just say, this is too much. We can't have this.
Let me just ask you then this question. How optimistic are you about getting back to a government that where Republicans and Democrats at least are civil and willing to try to work together? And what is it going to take to do that?
It's going to take recognizing that we have an amazingly serious national emergency that we have to face, and the only possible way of facing it successfully is to do it on a bipartisan basis where everybody gives something. And what I'm talking about is the dramatic increase in our national debt and the vulnerability that creates for our country. The average percent of gross domestic product of our national debt for the last 20 years has been 36%. It's now 52%. By the year 2019, it'll be 100%. That's how fast it's growing. In the year 2010, 5% of the budget was spent on interest on the national debt. The year 2020, it'll be 15%. So we've got this escalating problem where we're beholden to the Chinese and other countries. We've lost our flexibility to do other things other than service the debt. It is not a problem that can be solved simply by trimming waste. Cannot be done. It's important to be realistic about that. A lot of people want to think it can be done by trimming waste. It's not possible, and I will tell you why. In the year 2023, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on debt will exceed federal revenues. Now, think what that means. That means that 13 years from now, if we don't do anything else, we'll still be adding to the deficit and the debt. Let me tell you what doing everything else means. It means by the year 2023, if we abolish the military, Not just cut waste, abolish it. Abolish the military, abolish the Justice Department, close the national parks, empty the prisons and let the prisoners loose. Do nothing for education, nothing for research, nothing for anything else. Nothing. We're still going to be adding to the national debt. It is not possible. I'm not saying difficult. It is not possible to deal responsibly with the problem of the national debt without dealing with Social Security and Medicare. It can't be done. Now, you might say, well, I don't want it to be done. Okay, then let's decide that. Let's decide we're just going to stick it to our children and our grandchildren, and we don't care about them. Make the country weaker, grab what we can for ourselves. This is a serious problem. And the only way to get at the problem is to do it on a bipartisan basis where nothing is off the table. And the only way to do that is for the American people to get ahead of their politicians and say, look, you've got to fix this. So I think it can be done. I think most Americans in their hearts are patriots. I believe that what most people believe constitutes patriotism is something more than wearing a flag in their lapel or covering their heart when they say the Pledge of Allegiance. That means doing what is necessary to do what our forebears did, namely build a stronger country than what we inherited. We aren't doing that now. We're building a weaker country. But I think that if we focused on it, I think then there's an opportunity to rebuild and at least the chance to rebuild a kind of a bipartisan effort to deal with this important issue.
We're going to open it up after one more of my questions to all of you, and I would again ask you, if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for one of our students to come by with a cordless microphone, because we tape all of our programs and we want to make sure that your question is on the tape. But my final question is really one of the great parts of this job is getting to actually talk to individuals like yourself, Senator. And we had a fascinating conversation in my office just an hour or so ago, and you talked about it. We just made some incredible points, I thought, about the and these are my words, not yours, but the lack of intellectual depth in some of our leaders in politics today. Can you just offer some of the thoughts you shared with me on that?
Well, I grabbed a book off of your bookcase, which was a biography of Theodore Roosevelt, and he received a letter when he was president asking what he had read while he was president, and it was amazing. As president, he was reading history, he was reading political philosophy, he was reading works in the original language. I was spending a little bit of time a few months ago looking at the correspondence between Adams and Jefferson, and these long letters that they would write each other, obviously in longhand, about political philosophy and their views on this and that, and quoting to each other in Greek. I don't know any Greek, but I mean, they were so learned. I mean, they were so prepared for public service, so steeped in it. And so what I was saying to Bill earlier is, honestly, the political gene does not convey in my family, except I have a grandson he can be a politician. And he's about to graduate from high school, and the one thing I want to say to him is be learned. Just be learned. Know the difference between Jefferson and Hamilton. You know?
Very good.
Know what led up to the Civil War and what Lincoln was all about, and read some biographies. Truman said that. You know, here's a man, Truman never went to college. And Truman was asked by a young person, how do I prepare for politics? I'm interested. He said, read history. And I just think it's really important to try to understand what our country's all about.
Let the record show that after the senator told me the story about Teddy Roosevelt and the letter, that then he actually walked over to my books. Some of you may know that we have a collection from former Professor Francis Heller of the Law School of presidential biographies that he donated, and they stay in the director's office. So the senator actually walked over, took the exact book off the bookshelf, opened it up, paged through it a minute or so, and showed me that quote. And I thought that was pretty extraordinary. Pretty extraordinary. We're ready for questions from you, so please do wait for a microphone. We've got one over here, Andrew, that we'll get next.
Senator Danforth, thanks for coming out tonight. My question is real quick. If you were a candidate right now in 2010, would you renew the contract with America? And if so, how would you do that?
Well, I don't know. I'd have to look at it and what it was, and it's probably dated. But if I were running for president, which I won't do, and I've never had any interest in doing it, I would run on one issue, and that is the national debt. And I'd run on a Churchillian blood, sweat, toil, and tears. And it would be framed more optimistically than that, but I would run on the basis that we can't do this to our children. We cannot do it. We can't. I don't want to sound like I'm picking on Obama, but I will pick on Obama. He ran for president saying, here's the good news for the American people. We're going to increase spending on health care, on education, on infrastructure, on research, on veterans benefits, on this, that, and the other thing. That's really good news. And you want some more good news? If you're 95% of the American people, you won't have to pay anything more. And you want more good news? If you're 95% of the American people, you'll get a tax cut. And it is wrong to do that. And I think somebody should run for office who's prepared to lose and make that point.
Next question.
Is the filibuster of the Senate the kind of problem that is open to solution that Reid is proposing?
I think that the way to deal with the filibuster is to try harder to build bipartisan agreement on important subjects rather than to ram them through on a party line basis. I don't think there's anything wrong with the Senate going slowly and with government going slowly. It was designed that way. That's called checks and balances. It was supposed to go slowly. And it was, I don't think that we regret that much things we haven't done. But if we just continue to build one program after another and run up the debt, then I think we regret it. I think that on health care, it would have been possible to try to identify what are the problems we're trying to solve. And then can't we reach at least some agreement on how to approach those problems? But it wasn't done that way. It was done on a very ideological, very liberal basis. And it was, this is our way or the highway. And so obviously people who don't agree with that, what are they supposed to do? They're not going to crawl into a shell. They're going to try to say, we don't agree with it. We think it should be modified. Now, if there's an honest effort to try to solve problems and come up with some sort of common solutions, and then there are a small number of people, then invoke cloture. That's what cloture is for. But it's not to allow a situation where one side can just work its ideological will with less than 60 votes. I'm hopeful, you know. I mean, I'm not happy with the health care legislation, and I think it'll be passed on reconciliation, and I don't think that's a good thing to do. But am I generally hopeful about the country? I think the American people are decent people and they want a good country, and that's what they're going to get.
Other questions? We've got one right here that will get second. Tyler, if you'd get the question back there.
What are your feelings about a national commission to deal with the debt situation? Say, give it the power of law and let them decide.
Who's speaking? Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, a commission, I was the vice chair of the last commission. This was on entitlements. That was 1994, and it didn't do anything. I think that there's no way that a commission can trump Congress. And even if you did like a base closing commission, which this is not going to be, even if you did one that forced a vote up or down in Congress on what the proposals are, and you could reach proposals, then a subsequent Congress could simply undo it. So I don't think that the commission is going to come up with solutions. I think that the best thing that a commission can do is educate the American people as to what the real problem is. We tried to do that in 1994 when Bob Kerrey was the chair and I was the vice chair of the Entitlement Commission. We had wonderful charts. We had beautiful four-color charts demonstrating that, you know, that Social Security and Medicare are in real trouble and the problem this is going to cause for the country. We had 33 members of that commission, 32 voted for the report that put out the charts. Then we came to the final report on what are we going to do about it, and we couldn't get more than 6 of the 33 people to agree on anything. So it's really going to take political leadership to get anything done. And that's going to mean that the American people are going to have to understand it, and the American people are going to have to demand it. But I have a basic feeling about creating a commission and about announcing, as President Obama has, a 3-year freeze on non-security discretionary spending, which saves 0.5% of federal spending over the next 10 years. And that is that these are placebos, that they are ways of trying to convince people that government is doing something about the deficit and about the national debt when they're really not. So I see that as sort of, you know, creating the impression that government is serious without it being serious.
Okay, I think we had a question right here.
I'm a Republican, let me say that first, but I thought that the whole President Clinton, Monica Lewinsky thing was our worst hour in this country. And I've often wondered if the Republicans weren't behind having that whole scenario brought before the American people. And in that same note, it seems like character assassination has just become a hobby for both parties, and it makes everybody look bad. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about the importance of exposing people who are having affairs, and does that really improve our country to expose these human frailties?
No, it doesn't. No. I thought that the problem, the reason I took the position at the time, had I been in the Senate, I would have voted to remove President Clinton. I think in retrospect that was wrong. I think I was wrong in saying that because I think it would have been just too disruptive. But my view at the time was that lying to a grand jury is such a serious offense that it amounted to a high crime and misdemeanor. But no, I think that that was just an unfortunate time, and I think that trying to trap all these people in their various sexual oddities is not something that's good to do.
Questions? We have one right here.
My question for you, Mr. Senator, is as the son of evangelical Protestant ministers and someone who desires to go into public service in law and politics, how have you, for me, I wonder how you have dealt with the ambiguity between faith and field throughout your career.
Well, when you're in politics or when you're whatever else you're doing, you bring to it the totality of who you are. And the totality of who you are is you're a religious person, you're an evangelical Christian. That's what you are. That's what you bring to politics. You're the whole person. You're not just a part of a person who's lopped off to be a politician. Historically, religious people have been deeply involved in government and in politics. This has been true since Moses confronted Pharaoh. So this is old stuff. The prophets of ancient Israel confronted the kings of Israel. So religious people believe, a lot of them believe, that they have a religious obligation to be in politics and to make a contribution to politics. I think that the danger is when religion becomes divisive, and the way it becomes divisive is for people to think that, you know, I really know God's will, and I can translate God's will into a political platform, and people who don't agree with me aren't just people who don't happen to agree with me, they're enemies of God. So I think that people who are religious, deeply religious in politics, have to be able to say with Isaiah, my ways are not your ways, says the Lord. My thoughts are not your thoughts. That God's truth is big enough to encompass people with whom we very strongly disagree. And so I think that the gift of religious people to politics is the gift of humility.
Just to change the subject a bit, even though I'd like to continue that one, how do you view the effect that's going to be the fallout of the Supreme Court decision about money and politics from corporations?
I have not read that opinion, that decision. Theoretically, I can understand it. And I can understand people who say, well, wait a second, General Electric owns MSNBC. They're able to go on the air hour after hour with political stuff. How about everybody else? So I can understand it. And I can understand the legal theory that it is that restrictions on campaign funding are restrictions on political expression, and that that's a constitutional issue. But practically, it's going to make possible the absolute swamping of politics by people who are in organizations and businesses and labor unions that are willing to pump in immense sums of money to win particular races. So while I understand the constitutional argument, I think that the practical consequence is terrible.
Got a question right here.
Thank you for coming, Senator. Should the way that congressional district boundaries are determined be changed, and if so, what would you recommend?
I think it would be wonderful if they're changed. And I think that I'm not sure how to do it, because ultimately if it's not done by, I mean, it can be done by courts. If the population distribution is uneven, but other than that, it's always done by state legislatures. So they're going to try to match the district to keeping their members. But I think that the way to do it is just almost by computer. You know, just instead of trying to design for political advantage, just say, okay, you know, here is the latitude and the longitude, and here's the district, and create a bunch of boxes is the best way to do it. But I'm not holding my breath.
We have a little bit more time, and there are a number of students here tonight, so if you guys want to ask questions, raise your hand. We want to give you a chance as well. We've got maybe 3 or 4 more. We'll do about 3 more questions. We got 1 here, and we got like 2 back there. We'll get those, and that'll be it then.
Thank you, Senator. What would you say to those of us that are like coming of age as of right now into the kind of the political spectrum, what we could do to change the course of the country back to where we want it to be?
I think it's important to read history and understand what the country's about. I think it's important to be very realistic in trying to identify what the problems are, and therefore to educate yourself. A lot of people when I was in politics would come up and say, well, you're there, you know all the answers, we're out here, we don't. That's not true. I mean, people who take the time to be informed know every bit as much as you could want to know to be deeply involved in politics. So I think just educate yourself and be engaged in it, be involved in it, be outspoken. And hopefully to think, look, all of us are human, right? So all of us think about what's my interest. But try to leaven that lump as well, and try to think, it's not just about me, it's about the country and about the future of the country. And then try to participate and make your views known. And if you hear somebody say, we're going to solve our problems by creating a commission, call them out on it. Just say, that's a bunch of bull. More politely than that, I think. But just be engaged and try to build a good America.
You have a question back there?
Senator, I know the second year you were in the Senate, you had to make a very difficult vote on March 16th, 1978, when the Senate ratified the Panama Canal Treaty. The Senate was roughly the same then as it is now, 61 Democrats, 38 Republicans, and Harry Byrd Jr. The treaty was ratified 68 to 32. 52 Democrats and 16 Republicans voted for it. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to read these names. These were the Republicans who voted for the Panama Canal Treaty: Baker, Bellman, Brooke, Case, Chafee, Danforth, Hatfield, Mathias, Packwood, Pearson, Percy, Stafford, and Weicker. Is there a future for men and women like these in the Senate, people who will put partisanship aside and make very difficult votes in favor of the national interest?
I wonder if the questioner would identify himself.
Our old friend Ed.
Do I know you from
Yes,
somewhere?
sir, you do know me. I was there. I know what my boss, who was your colleague, the people in Missouri who knew he would support the treaty, knew he was a communist. The people who were concerned about you, many of whom were in your own party, and I think they were wondering what was going on.
Yeah, that was a tough one. Well, Ed Quick is an old friend, and I don't know what he's doing in Kansas, but he was a very, very key person on the staff of my Senate colleague, Tom Eagleton, and my very good friend, Tom Eagleton. We had a great relationship, and Ed had a great relation. Ed, our 2 offices had great relationships. Look, we had enough votes to do it. So it worked. I don't know if that would happen now, but it was true then. You could just get enough votes and do what was, it was very clear, I thought, that that was the right thing to do.
Just for the record, Ed, I wanted to point out that Bill Buckley actually supported the treaty, and one of the most amazing things I ever saw on television was he had Ronald Reagan on firing line, and they debated the Panama Canal Treaty, the two of them. That was amazing. Do we have a couple more questions? Okay, Scotty?
I, too, am very concerned about the debt and my grandchildren and eventually maybe great-grandchildren. There seems to be a young Republican voice that seems to be crying in the wilderness about this question. Paul Ryan, I wonder if you think there is a future for him in the Republican Party and hopefully the country.
I do not know him. I've seen him on TV and I've read some things that he's written, and I'm very, very impressed by Paul Ryan. I don't know who our future voices are going to be for our party, but I would think that he would be very, very promising.
We have time for one last question tonight, so this is the last one.
Senator, I guess I have one of those I was there questions also. As a follow-up, I had the good fortune to be outside the old Senate chamber when Senator Dole emerged from having just been elected very narrowly as majority leader, and he was greeting the press, was asked what provided the margin of victory. I think it was maybe one vote over Senator Stevens. And he said, well, Jack Danforth gave my nominating speech, and I was so impressed with what he had to say that I voted for myself. And I've never forgotten that absolute classic sense of humor. So I was going to ask you what you said in that nominating speech that was so compelling, but because you've already reflected earlier on that, I wanted to ask a completely different question, and a very serious one. Was there ever a time during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings that he was ready to give up and you had to talk him into persevering?
No. No. No, he wasn't. He wasn't. He was heartsick, and he was physically stricken. But no, he wasn't about to give up. I was saying to him, and more so than he ended up doing, but I was saying when he'd say, tell me how he felt about it, I'd say to him, Clarence, if that's how you feel, go up to that committee and tell him. Just say that. He was in my office the night that he testified. He testified in the morning, and then she testified, and then he came back at night. And before he came back again, he was sitting in my office. He was beside himself. We had darkened the office so that there were just very dim lights in it. He was sitting on the couch in my office, and he said to me, Jack, he said, you know what this is? This is a lynching. This is a high-tech lynching. And I said, Clarence, if that's the way you feel about it, you go up there and say that. I think people thought that that particular quote was a contrivance on his part. No, that's what he said to me in this darkened office. And if a president calls you and asks to nominate you for the Supreme Court, call me in advance and I'll try to warn you against it.
Senator, thank you so much for joining us, for all your insights tonight.
Thank you.